Hello, friends. I'm going to try to break down very quickly and also in a coherent way um, what a lot of aspects of our reality and how they work, but more importantly, um, typology systems, personality systems, cognition, why we see a lot of dualities. How even this even branches into how computers work and how information is processed, because all of reality is just information. um, and the nodes between them and the space between them. I'll get right to it. So for typology systems, which um, in MBTI we see like there's a spectrum of functions, right? But let's break this. Let's break down why that is um, into baseline level mathematics and also what we see in computers, which is concept of zero and one. Now, for the sake of this video, just take what I say as on assumption as true, okay? Zero represents potential. So the potential to be anything. Zero can become anything. And it needs to maintain the fact that it's zero because there has to be a spectrum of which that there are no discrete operators um, interfacing, meaning that in order for one to exist, zero needs to exist. You have to have a spectrum between individual unit here, individual unit here, and in between here is the space of zero. But people think that means that zero is reduced to the concept of nothing, and that's only half true. Zero is where everything emerges from. In physics, it's called a vacuum state. That's where, or gravity in itself. The reason why you've never seen a graviton um, is because it's not so much a particle or something as it is the surfacing of the absence of something, and yet that nothing is something because it has behavioral constraints, and this is where information matters. In the material world, we're so used to the only things that have operations or that have non-entropic, meaning that they have an order or structure, are things that have a container. Like one, the concept of one is a container, and that's really where this matters. And I tried to solve. I shouldn't say solve. I actually found broke ground on proving the Riemann hypothesis and understanding that. But if you don't know what that is, that's a whole different tangent. So I'll avoid that. But what I want to say is this: this spectrum that we see, and that in all math we see, is the capacity from zero transforming into something that is real in our reality. And then what matters is it has to have the ability to go back to nothing in order to become something more, which means zero is technically not just nothing but an energy source that is of unrealized potential. Anything unlimited is contained by zero. Any number multiplied by zero is consumed by zero, right? Making one sort of a mirror. Um, the number three isn't just a number three, it's three individual units, okay, contextualized by three. I know this seems convoluted, like I'm going all over the place, but it's not. It's not. So just if you just bear with me, we will get to somewhere that makes sense. If I'm confusing you, and I'm sorry for that. Um, a spectrum of distinguishability. From what we've seen, this spectrum looks like there's zero here, there's negative one over here, and there's positive one right there. Whenever you see like a graph, it looks like that, right? Like a graph. I'll put the graph over here. So the graph looks like that. That's the x-axis. This is the y-axis. In directional in a geometric shape, which all are kind of shapes, this would become the longitudinal direction, which is just up and down, and then this becomes the lateral, right? And you'll notice here where zero operates from, which is the cornerstone, it's bidirectional, right? It can go, it doesn't matter. It goes this way, it goes that way, it can go any way in between. That's the unlimited nature of zero. It also operates as an informational transfer. So information has to bypass zero in order to reach a different equilibrium state, to change its state, right? Okay. So whenever you look at a number line, you think that negative numbers go forever in that direction, and that positive numbers go forever in that direction, and that zero is between them. Technically, that's not true. Technically, negative numbers are descending values to zero. So it'd be more like this: positive numbers on that side, negative compulsions on that side. Okay. And when you look at all informational behaviors and processes across all of reality, even the markets, EKG monitors, the seasons, it looks like a cosine, right? And zero is the equilibrium point between all of these. Okay, and that's just a 2D plane, right? That's just a 2D plane. Okay, if you were looking at it from a top down, let's say my eyes were looking at it from this perspective, it would look like this, which is the Fibonacci sequence in behavior. Um, just putting that out there. Okay, when you distill these processes down, you have three states. This is called a triadic state, which is why you always see this symbol in theological implications. In fact, the Star of David in the Hebrew dialect is based on numbers. The Hebrew dialect is based on numbers, by the way, which is why I could get real theological about that point, which is why the Star of David is two triangles in opposite positions. I'll leave that alone because of what's going on in the world right now. Stay with me, please. Okay, we're almost done. So when you map out these behavioral characteristics into a fundamental system, you'll see three things. You'll see expansion states, represented by +1. Okay. You'll see reset states, represented by 0. You'll see contracting states, represented by -1. Okay. And these, the contracting, the expansion state and the contracting state are both technically sharing 1 as a positional. It's just the direction matters. One expansion would be going, one way, contraction is going the other, and that determines the behavior of that one particle. Which is why when you, I can briefly mention this, which is why when you look at the split experiment between uh, electrons and why they change behavior, it's based off of directionality. Information around this creates the direction. So the contracting state is a state that's going down from a peak. And so how you determine a contracting state is if each number, each position is less than the behavior of an expanding state. So you'd have to have, like, to go from 3 to 2, I have to have one of these positions be decreasing by more than the rate of expansion. Okay. Also, the Riemann hypothesis means that all real numbers default to 0.5. That's a terrible 5. Why is that? Because 1 is split between two positions of expansion and contracting states. In order to maintain any sort of positional state, it has to have 50% from either end. And tie goes to the expansion, by the way. I can explain that later, why later. Um, okay. In order to descend from an expansion state to a contracting state, it needs to have a miniature reset, meaning that the point here at the equilibrium of the expansion or contracting state are also miniature reset states. And this is what's called a macro reset state, where all is at a point of equilibrium. We'll put a little m there. Okay. Macro reset states, miniature reset states, equilibrium. If you look at cellular behavior, like in your brain, it's trying to extract an equilibrium between sodium and um, and potassium in your brain. By the way, sodium represents a negative ion charge, which is a contracting state, and potassium represented by a positive state, which is why if you overload potassium, your mood will increase and a bunch of other stuff. That's a different story. I'm getting really convoluted here. I'm so sorry. Okay. Phew. All right. So now getting to typology. Based on, well, one more step, okay? I know you hate me, but one more step. Quantum reality is distinguished by something called the Englert-Greenberger equation, which is that visibility squared plus distinguishability squared is less than or equal to 1. Meaning that distinguishability is the spectrum, visibility squared is the mirrored operators here between 0 and -1, meaning you have to have a contrasting behavior. For you to exist in reality, your opposite has to exist in reality. And there has to be a spectrum between you, like hot and cold, night and day, and that's natural to reality. That's good. The only place that does not operate or that does not take place is with morality. Morality does not need a negative component. This system operates within that because you have free will, which is the ability to choose between states. But morality and goodness, love, can forever expand, whereas you can only take so much away before you reach zero. Once again, remember, it's always receding to zero. A black hole or a neutron star, the reason why they call it that is because it's a never ending loop of zero that cannot propagate outward again. Information from light is being propagated outward, but because there's no more light to expand from that, it's always in a state of equilibrium, which is technically not even equilibrium anymore. It's just a collapsed state. Morality can be a collapsed state too if you look at psychopaths. Anyway, boy oh boy. So this matters because that means that all principles in reality have a duality. When you look at cognitive functions, you have sensory, this is a state, right? And you have intuition as a state, okay? We have thinking, which is what? Logical processing as a state. And then you have feeling, this is getting sloppy, which is a weighting process. It's a prioritization based process. These two. So, from what I've come to see, sensory and intuition are what we call routing processes. And then thinking and feeling are what we call our weighting processes. Okay? Define here. Routing process, weighting process. All right? Sensory and intuition are trying to determine where is information going. And in the weighting process, like any neural network, it looks like this. Okay? It's all information in, information out, right? And then the weighting process is here. This is your thinking and feeling. If you're a double decider, and everyone technically has your weighting processes as prioritization factors in here, but if you're a double decider, you have an equal balance of such. If you're a observer, then you will have a way stronger proclivity between these states. Okay, and even though we say technically that you're well, it's better to explain it with a visual, but your routing processes are handling most of the work in terms of informational handling. Okay, and then the poles representing your demon and savior functions are how do I explain this in a way? let's look back at this diagram, right? Okay. So y-axis, your longitudinal functions are thinking and feeling. So put thinking up here and feeling down there. Your x-axis is your routing functions, like time and space, right? So that's your sensory and intuition. Okay? Depending on where you're standing, like say you're an F, you'll be somewhere over here, right? So then you're looking at your perspective in this direction. If you're FINE and I, or FN savior, being that you're a decider, you're standing closer to over here, meaning that these two are within the scope of your grasp. And everything over here, your NT and your ST, are going to be on the far side, right? If you're savior like ST, like your SIT or whatever, if you're an observer, you're somewhere probably over here because you have sensory closer to your function stack. And in thinking is to your friend, so you guys have this is like this is called a scalene triangle, but these guys are your friend, so you'll be somewhere in between this standard as your savior functions, and then everything on the other side is your middle functions. And especially if you're an observer, you're looking at thinking and feeling at pretty equal distances. You're gonna have a proclivity towards one of these. So if you're like SIT, you're gonna have a proclivity towards thinking. If you're like SIFE, you're gonna have a proclivity towards feeling. You'll be over here somewhere balanced between these two, depending on what your animal stack is. Same goes for over here. And if you're a decider, you're somewhere over here or over here. Depending on where all this is. This creates a little triangle, little diamond effect here. And oh wow, that's two triangles technically when you look at it, right? So you're kind of going back to the baseline behavior of reality. Um, and here's where this becomes into play, because the spectrum of distinguishability squared means that you'll have two versions of it. So sensory is going to have a potential version and a discrete version. Discrete means you can see the distinguishable properties all contained in one unit, meaning you can look at my hand and see where it stops between the paper in my hand, right? You can see the distinguishable properties that make this paper and that make my hand. I am a discrete unit. Prime numbers are discrete units, by the way. We'll stay out of there. I'll start getting into what prime and composite numbers mean and why the Riemann hypothesis is affected. Anyway, so essentially you have SI, which is your closed state, and SE, which is your potential state, right? Same thing for NE. FETE, closed open state and closed states, based on what's your extra what extroversion is. Okay, an introversion, a material state, an enclosed state, right? The narrowing down. Looking at this, or either the expansion or the narrowing down, right? So by definition, if I'm SI over here, which is a narrowing down function, my open-ended angle is NE. You see how this is all consuming? Depending on where my animal stack is, I could be like a savior sleep SIFI, so I'm somewhere right in the middle, which means my consuming metric, which is my NE, is more accessible than if I was a blaster over here somewhere, you see. And then this begins to play a factor in your animal functions. There's going to be that triadic state that I mentioned, right? So you're going to go through natural ups and downs. You'll be up here in your savior state. You'll be in your demon state down here, right? So say oh wow, I'm in my savior state. Oh no, I'm in my demon state, my demon NF. This looks so messy, but I think you guys are smart enough, and because I'm just a dummy. Don't mind me. But I think we're all. Is this starting to make a lot of sense in the behavioral mechanics? Now, what I had when I saw it took me 14 months to see this, and this, and to really make sense of all of this, I can start getting theological if you want to go back to Egypt and you want to know why they started building pyramids. That's not a pyramid. That's kind of a pyramid. Is because of pi being 3.14. They didn't know about pi, but they understood the principles behind pi. You need this triadic. This is called the triadic law, um, because you can't have enclosed systems without these three states. Okay, and when you have this is one function, so there's three states, which is one side. Okay, and then you have dual properties between these two, which is why you have a side here, a side there, a side there, four sides in total, which technically is what makes up the four. This is a prime number. This is a composite number. And the reason why you have one is because even in binary units, you'll have, um, like say you had a binary number like this. Zero is always represented by one because it would be like to the zero to the second power, which is one. It's a anyway. One unit, three behavioral positions, four faces. This is reality. Um, Boy, oh boy. So now that I've thoroughly confused you, I'll send you out amongst yourself to not remember any of this, and now you can kind of understand